We have all seen it, standing silently above Rio de Janeiro, arms stretched toward the sky as if it has always belonged there. But this monument was never supposed to be easy to build. More than 1,000 tons of reinforced concrete stand roughly 700 meters above sea level on an exposed mountain peak where powerful winds can exceed 200 kilometers per hour. To understand how this enormous figure came into existence, we have to return to 1921. Brazil was preparing to celebrate the centenary of its independence and wanted a monument that could represent the nation. Mount Corcovado, meaning hunchback, quickly became the natural choice. But choosing the mountain was one thing. Building on it was something else entirely. Corcovado is essentially an enormous granite summit surrounded by dense rainforest and exposed to the violent weather systems of the Atlantic. The engineering challenge was immense. Engineer Heitor da Silva Costa won the competition to design the monument. But his original idea looked nothing like the Christ we know today. He imagined Christ holding a cross in one hand and a globe in the other. The public response was brutal. People mockingly referred to the design as Christ with the ball. The criticism forced Silva Costa back to the drawing board, and eventually he discovered a much more elegant solution. Instead of making Christ hold a cross, Christ himself would become the cross. The final design adopted the clean geometric lines of Art Deco, modern, simple, and visually powerful. But beneath that simplicity was a terrifying engineering question. How do you build a giant human-shaped structure with arms stretched wide on top of a mountain exposed to hurricane-force winds? In the 1920s, one of the biggest decisions was the material. Steel seemed like the obvious answer. After all, structures such as the Eiffel Tower had already demonstrated what steel could accomplish. But Silva Costa chose something more unusual: reinforced concrete. It was a bold decision. Steel exposed to Rio's humid, salty environment would require constant protection and maintenance. Reinforced concrete, on the other hand, could provide the mass and rigidity needed to create the enormous figure. But nobody had ever attempted anything quite like this. The statue would weigh approximately 1,145 tons. And its weight wasn't the only problem. The wind was. Christ's outstretched arms create a huge surface for the wind to push against. At extreme speeds, the pressure becomes enormous. The structural calculations were assigned to Albert Cacotte, one of France's leading engineers. His job was to determine how the structure could support its own enormous weight while also surviving the forces constantly attacking it from the outside. And then there was another problem. How do you construct thousands of tons of reinforced concrete hundreds of meters above sea level in a place where rain, fog, humidity, and temperature can change rapidly? While Brazilian engineers were studying the mountain and its foundations, the artistic side of the monument was being developed in France. Silva Costa knew that concrete alone would not give the statue the appearance he wanted. He needed an artist. That artist was Paul Landowski. Landowski worked from his studio in Boulogne-Billancourt, creating full-scale plaster models of the most important parts of the statue. The head alone was about 3.75 meters high. Each hand measured roughly 3.2 meters. The enormous models were divided into sections and transformed into molds that could eventually be transported to Rio. Once the pieces arrived on Corcovado, they had to be combined with the internal structural framework. Imagine trying to assemble a gigantic three-dimensional puzzle where every piece has to meet a metal skeleton with millimeter-level accuracy. A tiny mistake near the bottom could become a massive error near the top. And this was happening in the 1920s. There were no modern construction cranes capable of simply lifting everything into place. There wasn't even a normal road to the summit. The primary connection was the Corcovado Railway, a rack railway that had been operating since the 19th century. Every load had to travel up the mountain by rail. Cement, sand, water, scaffolding, plaster molds, construction equipment. Everything had to make the journey, and there was barely enough room at the summit to store supplies. That meant the construction operation had to function almost like a perfectly timed machine. Materials arriving in the morning had to be used quickly. Workers operated in clouds and rain, with wet scaffolding and steep drops surrounding them. The conditions were extremely dangerous. Yet during the 9-year construction period, no fatal accident was officially recorded. For a project of this scale and era, that achievement alone was extraordinary. And what makes the monument even more fascinating is that it isn't a solid statue. From the outside, Christ appears to be a gigantic block of stone. Inside, however, it is more like a 12-story hollow building. A network of structural elements, beams, pillars, and diagonal supports carries the forces downward toward the foundations. Those foundations are anchored directly into the granite of Corcovado. An internal metal staircase provides access through the structure, reaching from the lower sections toward the arms and head. Inside, the spaces are narrow and cramped, and somewhere around chest level is one of the strangest details of the entire monument. Silva Costa had a small heart-shaped feature incorporated into the structure. It exists both inside and outside the statue. From the ground, almost nobody can see it, but it remains there as a hidden signature, a tiny human detail buried inside one of the world's most recognizable monuments. Yet there was still another threat. Concrete may be incredibly strong, but it is not completely immune to water, temperature changes, and cracking. Silva Costa needed an exterior material capable of protecting the structure for decades. The answer came from Minas Gerais, steatite, commonly known as soapstone. This unusual stone is relatively soft when extracted from the earth, but becomes remarkably durable when exposed to the elements. The challenge was figuring out how to cover an enormous curved surface with thousands upon thousands of small pieces. The solution was astonishingly simple and incredibly labor-intensive. The exterior was covered with millions of tiny triangular pieces of soapstone. Each fragment was only a few centimeters across. Instead of attaching every piece individually to the statue, workers created sheets of stone pieces mounted onto linen. Thousands of women from Rio's parishes helped prepare these sheets by hand, piece after piece, sheet after sheet. The material was eventually carried up the mountain and applied to the statue's surface. And many of the women reportedly used the opportunity to write names, messages, or personal wishes on the backs of the stones. So, beneath the visible exterior of Christ, the Redeemer, are countless hidden human stories. The statue may appear gray from a distance, but its surface is actually a vast mosaic of stone fragments. Millions of pieces working together to shield the structure beneath from the relentless humidity of the tropical environment. But Corcovado had one final enemy: lightning. The monument's position makes it a natural target for electrical storms. During Rio's rainy season, powerful lightning strikes can hit the mountain with tremendous force. So the engineers incorporated a protection system into the statue itself. The internal metal framework functions much like a Faraday cage. Lightning protection was integrated into the upper parts of the monument, including the head and hands, allowing electrical energy to travel through the metal structure and toward the mountain's foundations. But even this system cannot completely prevent damage. Lightning can be so powerful that it can destroy sections of the soapstone exterior. In 2014, one particularly intense strike damaged Christ's right thumb. Repairing something like that isn't a normal construction job. Specialized workers, many with professional climbing experience, have to descend from the statue itself and work hundreds of meters above the ground. They move along the outstretched arms, suspended over the void, carefully replacing damaged stone. And whenever possible, replacement material is selected to match the original stone used during construction. Nearly a century after the project began, the same fundamental challenge remains. How do you preserve a monument designed to fight wind, rain, humidity, lightning, gravity, and time? The answer is constant maintenance. But on October 12, 1931, none of that future work mattered yet. The lights were switched on, and the world finally saw the completed Christ the Redeemer. It was more than a religious monument. It was the result of 9 years of calculations, engineering, craftsmanship, transportation, and extraordinary human labor. A structure weighing more than 1,000 tons somehow appears almost weightless because of its elegant Art Deco form. Its simplicity is deceptive. Behind those open arms is a complex structural system. Behind the gray surface are millions of tiny pieces of stone. Behind the monument is a mountain of engineering calculations, and inside it, all is the hidden heart-shaped detail left by the people who imagined and built it. So the next time you see Christ the Redeemer standing above Rio, don't just see the famous silhouette. Look deeper. See the reinforced concrete skeleton, the metal framework, the granite foundations, the millions of hand-placed stones, the railway that carried materials up the mountain, the workers who climbed dangerous scaffolding through clouds and rain, and the engineers who had to make an impossible-looking structure survive the forces of nature. Because Christ the Redeemer isn't simply a statue. It is what happens when architecture, art, engineering, and human ambition meet on the edge of the impossible. Engineering isn't only about calculating what can stand. Sometimes it's about having the courage to build what seems like it shouldn't. And that is what makes Christ the Redeemer one of the world's great architectural achievements. If you enjoyed discovering the hidden engineering behind iconic structures, subscribe to Ancient Records. Because behind every great monument, there is another story waiting to be uncovered.